Hello everyone, hope everyone's well, enjoying the weather. This message is titled Let's Talk About Sex, and so it's just to talk about sex. It's something I've been thinking about recently, and I thought I'd do an audio on it. So just to lay out the groundwork, sex, we are going to be talking about it in the context of a biblical marriage, which is one man, one woman, a God-ordained biblical marriage context. So it's for married couples. And so, I want to go straight into it. That's one of the reasons that that I've been thinking about that I want to talk about. But before we do that, I think to my mind, certainly, there's three reasons why God's given us sex. The first one is for our pleasure. So, sex is there to be pleasurable between a husband and a wife. So, when we read the Book of Solomon, we can see how some of that pleasure is depicted. Feel free to read that in your own time. I know it's not something or a particular book of the Bible that is preached on the pulpit, but it is there, and it's by no accident that that's included in the Bible. So, sex is there for our gratification, our pleasure. And God wants us to have sexual pleasure within the context of a marriage. Which is a safe, loving environment for us to express those sexual desires and experience those sexual pleasures. So it's very apparent that God allowed sex for us for our pleasure. So that's the first reason. The second reason is that sex is given for procreation. So in order for evolution to happen, obviously there has to be procreation. And so God has allowed sex to happen so that we can further the human race. And natural selection or evolution, or whatever name you wanna put to that, can only happen through sex. Well, certainly at the moment, that can only happen through a man and a woman coming together, or an egg and a sperm coming together, which, have to be provided by a male and a female. So whether that's artificially put together or artificially inseminated, they have to be provided by a male and a female. So in the biblical sense of it, it's a man and a woman coming together, and the sperm and the egg coming together to form new life. And God uses that to form new life. It's important that we remember that family is the backbone. The family is the foundation of society. And so as Christians, we believe that in order to the best chance to have a good start in life, it has to happen in a family, in a solid family unit, which is the mum, the dad, the parents, and obviously bringing up children. Ideally, those children will have Christian values and they'd be raised in a Christian home, and that's our belief as Christians. And so, sex is there for procreation, to bring new life, to bring children about. It's not to say that those that don't have children or can't have children or choose not to have children, it's not to say they're deficient in any way. No, it's just to say that is the environment, or if you would like, the equation that God has allowed for new life to be brought about. So, first reason, sex is there for our pleasure. It's there for procreation, which is obviously the obvious one. And then thirdly as well, which is the point I've been thinking about, and I want us to concentrate on. These three reasons are by no means exhaustive. This is just the obvious ones. But the third one that perhaps hasn't been so obvious to me and that occurred to me is that sex is there to stop us from committing sin. Sex has been given to us to stop us from committing sin. Genesis 2:24 says, a man leaves his mother and father and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. So it's obvious that when sex happens, there's some kind of unification that happens between the two parties. And so, this is important because if you're going to unite yourself, if you imagine that every time you have sex with somebody, you're uniting yourself and becoming one flesh with that person, it makes sense that should only happen within the safe context of the marriage, which is the one partner. But when people then do go on to have several partners, you can imagine that that unification then happens, or that becoming one flesh then happens with several people. And I have heard some pastors talking about it as some kind of covenant or spiritual hold or bondage or something like that, where, you know, if you have different many partners, then you end up being unified or spiritually bonded to these different partners, and that's not even healthy. Not healthy physically, certainly, because there are STIs and other things out there, but also spiritually that's not healthy. So, you know, it's there to protect us from that spiritually, but also it's very clear in 1 Corinthians 6:18. It says that all other sins a person commits are outside the body, but whoever sins sexually sins against his own body. So there's an idea there of sexual immorality, whether that's fornication or adultery or any kind of sexual immorality. That's a sin against ourselves, and we believe that our bodies are the temple of God. And so if our bodies are the temple of God, and we carry the Holy Spirit when we're born again, as we believe, then surely committing sexual immorality, a sin against our own body, would be, you know, it is a grave sin. I mean, you know, every other sin, like he says, is external, but this one sin is the one against our own bodies. And so that's important, you see, because I would like us to think about that. Just think about that, ponder that for a moment. Just think on that for a moment. But the key thing here that I want us to concentrate on, it's in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 8 and 9. This is really like sort of what I've been thinking about. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 8 tells us, let's back up to verse 6. It says, this is Paul speaking to the church in Corinth. I say this as a concession, not as a command. I wish that all of you were as I am, but each of you has your own gift from God. One has this gift, another has that. And then in chapter 8, which is where I want us to concentrate on, it says, now to the unmarried and the widows, I say, it is good for them to stay unmarried as I do. Verse 9, which is the crucial part, it says, but if they cannot control themselves, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. This is sort of what I want us to concentrate on. So this idea that it's better to be married and express those sexual desires within the context of a marriage than it is to burn with passion. And burning with passion can then lead you to commit other sins, sins against your own body, sins of sexual immorality. And so Paul's saying here, it's better, you know, it's good for you to be single if you can stay single, if you can control those passions. But if you cannot control those sexual desires, then it is better for you to be married and be in the safe institution of marriage, where you can express those desires, those sexual, and have that sexual gratification within that God-ordained sanctity or institution that is married. So it's better for you to be married than to burn with passion. Because when you burn with passion, you're then easily led into temptation to commit a sin of sexual immorality against your own self. And Paul doesn't want us to do that. And so if you're then in a marriage, but you're also then refusing your spouse sex for whatever reason, you're pissed off, you don't feel like it, you're constantly married, you're constantly tired, I want you to think about this, because if those reasons are legit, which, you know, for a lot of times, especially for women, they are legit, I want you to think about the effect that's having on your spouse. By refusing him the sex, you are, in effect, potentially putting temptation in his way. Because one of the reasons it seems that Paul's saying to us to get married is to be able to express ourselves sexually within marriage. If there is a spouse in a marriage that's not having the opportunity to express themselves sexually in that marriage, then that could lead them into temptation and lead them to sin. So my question to you is, are you leading your spouse to sin? Are you constantly tired? Are you letting them go for long periods of times without sex? Are you then causing them to lust after other people? Because, the Bible's clear. Whosoever shall even look at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery in his heart. Are you causing your spouse to commit adultery in their heart? Are you causing them to lust after somebody because those sexual desires are not being met? Now, this is not a pass for men or women that are adulterous or lustful, or that way inclined. No, this is for those that genuinely, seriously seek God and want to be faithful in their marriage. However, the other person in that marriage is not making it easy because they're constantly withholding sex. So, one time you might say, yeah, I'm tired. And another time, the kids have worn you out. But if that's the case, rather than saying no to your partner all the time, how about you have a conversation with them in recognition of the fact that you are the only person that can help stop them from committing any act of sexual immorality or adultery against themselves, against their own body. You have that power. Again, like I say, this is not a pass for adulterous men or men that have such desires, or the spirit of lust in them. This is not a pass for them. This is genuinely for those men that want to be faithful, that are trying desperately hard to be faithful and express those men and women, I suppose, express those desires within the marriage, but are not being allowed to do so by their spouse. So I want you to think about this. Is your refusal of your spouse, is your refusal of sex to your spouse causing them to sin against their own bodies? If so, then the Bible's clear, we shouldn't cause another to sin. So think about it. Why are you saying no? Are you saying no for health reasons? Because you just don't feel like it? Because you're constantly tired? If that's the case, then you should be speaking to your spouse about it and saying, well, I'd like you to help out a little bit more so that when it comes to time for us to have sex, I'm not constantly so tired. I'd like you to help out with the kids a bit more. I'd like you to help around the house a bit more. I'd like to be able to work less. Or, you could say, I'd like to be able to have some time alone. Because then you've got to remember, for men are very visual. So for this is very, very generalization. For most men, the sex will come first, then the intimacy will come. However, for most women, again, there are exceptions to the rule, but for most women, the intimacy is going to come first before the sex comes. And women are not visually stimulated. Some are, but most aren't. They'll need to feel close to you throughout the day, or feel that emotional connection for them to even want to have sex with you. Whereas men they're visually connected, they're visually aroused and visually stimulated. So for them, it can literally just be a turn on, like they just look at you. And so, but for the women, you've got to get past that initial intimacy to be able to get them aroused or stimulated sexually. But for the men, you need to get past that initial physical gratification and release to be able to get the intimacy out of them. And so you've got to think about within your marriage, how is that going to work for you? How is that going to look like for both of you? How are you both going to communicate and behave so that you don't cause each other to sin? Because it's clear to me here that Paul's saying one of the ways to avoid sexual sin is to get married. And so when you are in a marriage, you need to be doing everything in your power to help your spouse avoid sexual sin. You need to be able to be doing everything in your power to help your spouse avoid sexual sin. Paul's clear in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. He's clear there. In verse 19, he says, "Do you not know that your bodies are the temples of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own. You were bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies." This is, verse 18 is where he speaks about flee from sexual immorality. So if that's the case, and you hold the keys to your spouse fleeing from sexual immorality, you've then got to think about that responsibility that you have to shield them from sexual immorality, or to shield them from sin, to shield them from adultery and lust. Because if you're not playing your part, then you're leading them to sin. I mean, the Bible's clear throughout, isn't it? It's clear throughout about, not causing your brother to stumble. Romans 14:21 says, it is good not to eat meat or drink wine or do anything that causes your brother to stumble. It's clear throughout. There's so many Bible passages that tell us to be careful to not cause others to stumble or to cause others to sin. Romans 14:20 says, "Do not for the sake of food destroy the work of God. Everything is indeed clean, but it is wrong for anyone to make another stumble by what he eats." I mean, this is obviously speaking about what you eat or drink, but it's clear there that we shouldn't cause another to sin. And so if you are causing your spouse to sin, is that a responsibility that you want? Is that something that you want? I mean, it's clear, isn't it? 1 Corinthians chapter 7 from verse 5 says, "Do not deny yourselves to each other, unless you first agree to do so for a while in order to spend your time in prayer. But then resume normal marital relations. In this way you will be kept from giving in to Satan's temptation because of your lack of self-control." It's there. Paul's saying, do not deny yourself of each other, because unless by mutual consent. So, for some people who will decide, for example, they want to go on a month-long fasting and prayer and abstinence without speaking to their spouse about it. But then that's not by mutual consent, because then you're denying the other person of sexual relations. So what have they didn't agree to that. So what then do they do for that month? That month where they haven't agreed to it, and you're causing them to sin, yet you're praying to God and expecting your prayers to be answered. That's, we've got to think about how we're behaving to each other in marriage, especially. So Paul's clear here. He says, if you agree to it together, that's fine. Go ahead and do your fasting. Go ahead and do your prayers. But it's got to be a mutual agreement. Go ahead and do your abstinence. It's got to be by mutual agreement. However, when you're done, come back together so that the evil one, Satan, will not tempt you. So that Satan will not tempt you to sin. If you're doing it without the consent of your spouse, then you're leaving the door open for Satan to tempt them to sin. And you're leaving the door open for Satan to come into your marriage, because what happens when you for example, you're on your long course of fasting and prayer for a month, but then you've left the door open to Satan because you haven't consented with your spouse. And then in that month, your spouse hasn't consented to the abstinence, and your spouse then strays and commits adultery and then brings a third party into your marriage, or defiles the marriage bed, which, Paul's clear that the marriage bed should be kept undefiled and pure. What then happened? The door's left open to Satan, and he comes into the marriage and destroys all the work that you've been trying to build. But then you're sat there thinking, but I was praying, this was for a good cause. It was for a good cause, but you didn't do it the right way. You're sat there thinking, but I went on a month of fasting and prayer. And yes, God answered my request I was praying for, but then he took, the enemies destroyed my marriage. But you left the door open for the enemy to come in and destroy your marriage by not doing what the Bible has advised. What Paul said that's not a command, he said it's an advice. So let us take it with the wisdom that it is given with. If you're going to go on a period of abstinence, let it be by mutual consent. And then when you are done, come back together very quickly. If you're tired because you've been on your feet all day, you're constantly running around the kids, you've been working, speak to your spouse about it. Find ways of making yourself less tired. If you feel not connected to your spouse throughout the day, but you need that intimacy before you have sex, speak to your spouse about it. Find ways to create that intimacy so that it then doesn't become a chore when you do get to the point of having sex. If you have a low sex drive or really don't feel up to it most of the time, speak to your spouse about it and get medical help. If you're constantly tired, it might be something as easy as iron levels being too low or vitamin D levels being too low. If you feel you don't have the urge all the time, it might be something as simple as your contraceptive methods, or if you're taking a contraceptive pill or hormonal pill or injection, it might be something as changing that to something else. But unless you're engaging in these conversations, you will not get those answers that you so desperately seek and need to keep your marriage pure. If you're not feeling up to it all the time, or you perhaps feel that your spouse is too demanding of sex, speak to them about it and say, okay, well, I really can't keep up with you every night, but I'll meet you halfway and do 2 or 3 times a week. Be accommodating of each other. Be able to compromise with each other. Because that's the only way that we're going to help each other to flee from sexual immorality and to sin against our own bodies, which are the temple of God, which house the Holy Spirit. And so if you are the spouse that's not wanting sex all the time, think about what that means for your partner. If you are the spouse that is constantly saying no to sex, you've got that responsibility. Again, like I say, this is not a pass for men that are just adulterous in nature or lustful in nature. This is for the men or the spouses that genuinely want to stay faithful in the marriage. So I want us to think about that and think about ways in which we can help each other, help our spouses to stay pure, help our spouses and help each other to keep the marital bed pure as we've been advised. Help each other to not defile our own bodies, to not commit any sin of sexual immorality against our own bodies. So, sex is there for our pleasure. Yes, great. Sex is there for procreation. Absolutely. But it is also there to protect us from sin. From sinning against God and against our own bodies. It is also there to protect our marriages and protect our homes. And the only way we can do that is by creating an environment that allows for those sexual pleasures and desires to be met. By not saying no all the time. And if you are the spouse that's saying no all the time, examine the reasons why you're saying no all the time. Get to the root cause of it. Communicate it with your spouse. And say, I really would like us to have as much sex as you would like. I really would like us to both be able to not burn with passion whilst we're married, because I understand and I appreciate that this union of marriage is there for us to be able to express or ignite and use up those passions without them burning us on the inside and leading us to sin. But I really can't do it because of X, Y, Z. Could you please help me? Or could you please help me seek the answers to X, Y, Z? Let's work as a team. because I don't want you to lust after somebody else. I don't want you to go out there and look at somebody else. I don't want you to go out there and commit adultery. Not on account of my not giving you what I'm supposed to give you within the context of the marriage. So let's go away and think about this. And if you've got any questions or comments, feel free to join the Facebook group and we can discuss this further. Like I say, this is not a pass. It's not a dig at anyone. It's not a pass at people that are just adulterous in nature. It's just meant to get us to think a bit further about how our actions in marriage are affecting our spouses and whether we're leading them to sin or protecting them from sin. Whether we're causing them to sin against God and against us and against themselves, or whether we're protecting them. I look forward to hearing from you, and I will be with you again soon. Take care. God bless.